I'm glad you're here with me today. Follow this story until the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. My son got the house on Maple Ridge Drive, 4 bedrooms, 2-car garage, the one his father and I spent 22 years paying off. I got the old bait shop by the lake, and when my daughter-in-law found out, she laughed so hard she had to set down her wine glass. "Oh, that's just perfect for you," she said, pressing her lips together like she was trying to look sympathetic and failing completely. "A rotting shack that smells like fish couldn't be more fitting. I want to tell you something. I'm 64 years old, my name is Bev." And that was the moment I finally understood who my son had become. It started on a Wednesday in late October. I'd been staying with my sister in Tucson for 2 weeks. She'd just had knee replacement surgery and needed someone to drive her to physical therapy, pick up her prescriptions, make sure she didn't try to climb a step stool on day 4 because she felt fine. I came back home to Hartwell, Michigan on the afternoon bus, the kind with the cracked seat armrest and the air conditioning that works too hard even in fall. I had a small rolling suitcase, a bag of tamales my sister had packed for me, and a heart that felt lighter than it had in months. Being useful will do that to a person. My son Kevin had called while I was on the bus. His voice had that particular flatness I'd learned to recognize over the past 3 years, ever since he married Jolene. It's the voice he uses when he wants to say something he knows isn't right but has already decided to say anyway. "Mum, we need to go over some things when you get in, about the estate." His father, my husband Gary, had died 14 months earlier, a heart attack, sudden and merciless, in the parking lot of the hardware store he'd owned for 31 years. I'd spent those 14 months trying to keep my footing in a life that no longer had the person who'd always steadied me in it. "Of course," I told Kevin, "I'll come by the house tonight." I should have taken the way he said "okay" as a warning, just "okay." No "great, Mom," or "see you then." Just that flat, pressed down "okay" and the sound of the call ending. Kevin and Jolene's house, my house, the house I'd lived in for 2 decades, was lit up when the cab dropped me off. Through the front window, I could see the new furniture Jolene had ordered the previous spring. Clean lines, no warmth to it. She'd put it in the moment Gary got too sick to say anything about it, which I'd noticed but chosen not to mention. Kevin answered the door in a dress shirt, which struck me as odd for a Wednesday evening at home. Jolene sat in the living room with a glass of red wine and the look of someone who'd rehearsed this. "Mom." Kevin kissed me on the cheek, barely. "Sit down." I sat. I set the tamales on the coffee table because I didn't know what else to do with them. Jolene looked at them the way she sometimes looked at me, like something that had appeared without being invited. Kevin had an envelope. He opened it on his lap like it was something fragile. "Dad's attorney called last week," he said. "There were some final details about the estate distribution, some things that needed to be sorted." I nodded. Gary's attorney, Phil Merritt, had been handling things slowly and carefully. Gary had been meticulous about his business records, but less so about personal paperwork, and Phil had told me at the beginning it would take time. "The house," Kevin said, and then stopped. He looked at Jolene. She smoothed her skirt. "The house," she said, picking up where he left off with that practiced ease of someone taking over a presentation, was left to Kevin, along with the hardware store. She paused. "Your name isn't on the deed, Bev. Gary had it transferred about 4 years ago for estate planning purposes, tax reasons. Phil can explain the details." I felt the floor shift slightly, not collapse, just shift. The house I've lived in for 22 years. It was always technically Gary's, Jolene said, and now it's Kevin's. She took a sip of wine. "And I get the bait shop." I said it before Kevin could. I already knew. The Lakeview bait and tackle on the eastern shore of Dunmore Lake had been in Gary's family for 40 years. His uncle had built it, Gary had inherited it, and for most of our marriage it had sat there generating modest income from seasonal fishermen and the occasional tourist who didn't know any better. It was small, the roof had needed replacing for years. I hadn't been inside it in almost a decade. "There's actually not nothing," Kevin said quickly. "There's the building, the dock, the land itself." "Oh, honey, let's be honest." Jolene set down her glass and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as comfortable cruelty, the kind that has stopped bothering to hide itself. "It's a bait shack. It hasn't turned a real profit in years. There's probably mold." She tilted her head. "But it's cozy, right? In a rustic way. It suits you. You always liked simpler things." Kevin didn't say a word. "You and your father used to drive out there when you were little," I said to him. I don't know why I said it. Maybe I needed him to remember who we'd been to each other. He looked at the envelope in his hands. Jolene smiled the way people smile when they've won something. We thought it might be easier for everyone if you packed up your room here before the end of the month. Fresh start for all of us. Kevin and I have been talking about converting the bedroom into a nursery. She touched her stomach. Not dramatically, just once, briefly. We're expecting 11 weeks. We were going to tell you properly, but now seemed like the right time. I looked at my son who was going to be a father, my son who was sitting in a dress shirt in the house I raised him in, watching his wife tell me to pack my things. I stood up. I picked up the tamales from the coffee table because I'd be damned if I was going to leave them there. I'll be out by the weekend, I said. Kevin walked me to the door. Mom, he started. Good night, Kevin. I stayed at a Comfort Inn on Route 9 that night. I ordered a grilled cheese from the diner next door and ate it sitting on the edge of the bed watching the local news with the sound too low to hear. At some point I fell asleep, still dressed, and woke up at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how 35 years of marriage and a lifetime of putting my family first had brought me to a motel room with a styrofoam cup on the nightstand. The next morning, I drove out to the bait shop. I'd expected the worst. What I found wasn't the worst. The Lakeview sat on a small spit of land where the road curved closest to the lake. The main building was maybe 800 square feet, old pine boards, green trim that had faded to something almost grey. A hand-painted sign above the door that Gary's uncle had made in 1981. The dock extended about 30 feet out over the water. 2 of the boards were loose. The sign in the window still said open, even though it hadn't been opened since Gary got sick. But when I pushed open the door, something surprised me. It was clean. Not just not terrible, actually maintained. Someone had swept the floors recently. The old cooler units had been unplugged but wiped down. On the counter, next to the old cash register that had never once been replaced, was a mason jar with a handful of dried wildflowers in it. My throat tightened in a way I wasn't expecting. On the wall behind the counter, there was a photograph I'd never seen. Gary as a young man, maybe 30 years old, standing on the dock with a large man I didn't recognize, both of them holding fishing rods and laughing. On the back, in Gary's handwriting, August 1989, teaching Darnell everything he knows. I was still looking at the photograph when someone knocked on the open door. He was in his early 70s, heavy-set, with grey at his temples, and the kind of face that's seen a lot of weather. He held a foil-covered pan. Mrs. Calloway. He stepped inside without waiting for an answer, which should have annoyed me but didn't. I'm Darnell Webb. I live about a quarter mile up the road. I've been keeping an eye on this place since Gary passed. Figured you'd be showing up sooner or later. He held out the pan. Made you a chicken casserole. You look like you haven't eaten. I had a grilled cheese last night, I said. That doesn't count. He set the casserole on the counter and looked at me with the directness of someone who doesn't waste time with pleasantries because he respects you too much to pretend. Gary told me about you, he said. Said when the time came and you got here, I should tell you something specific. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He wrote it down because he said he knew I'd mess up the wording. He made me promise to give it to you in person. My hands weren't quite steady when I took it, but it was Gary's handwriting without any question. The slightly cramped capital letters, the way his G's always looked like they were leaning forward. Bev, if Darnell's giving you this, then you're standing in the shop, and things have gone the way I was afraid they might. Don't be too hard on Kevin. He's weak in some ways. His grandfather was weak, and I should have done more about it. But you're not weak. You never have been. Look in the storage room, the locked cabinet under the window. Key is on the ring behind the counter, the small brass one. I've been meaning to tell you about this for years, and kept finding reasons to wait. I'm sorry about that. There's a lot more to this shop than fish bait, sweetheart. Always has been. I found the key ring. I found the small brass one. I found the locked cabinet. Inside were property surveys, correspondence with the Dunmore County Development Office, a folder labeled simply Lakeview Parkle Confidential, and a handwritten letter from Gary dated 8 months before he died. I sat down on the floor of that storage room and I read everything. Here is what I learned. The bait shop was not just the bait shop. It sat on one of the last privately owned parcels of undeveloped lakefront property on the eastern shore of Dunmore Lake, 3 acres of pine and shoreline that, according to the surveys Gary had commissioned, was directly adjacent to a proposed resort and marina development that the county had approved in principle 2 years earlier. 3 development companies had already approached Gary about the land. He had turned all 3 of them down. Not because the land wasn't worth selling, because he had other plans for it. His letter was long. I'll tell you the parts that mattered most. I know what this land is worth, Bev. I've known for about 6 years. The day I found out, I almost called you immediately, and then I started watching the way Jolene talked about our future, the way Kevin let her, and I decided I needed to be careful. I don't think Kevin would do anything deliberately wrong, but I think he'd let something wrong happen if she pushed hard enough, and she would push. The parcel, with lakefront rights and the marina access easement, is worth somewhere between $2 and $3 million in the current market. If the resort development moves forward the way the county plans, that number goes higher. I'm leaving it to you because it's yours. Because you worked the register every summer for 15 years, when Kevin was young and I was too proud to admit I needed help. Because you never asked me for anything I wasn't able to give, and because I trust you to decide what it becomes. There's a woman named Beverly. Yes, another Beverly I know, at the law firm of Strickland and Marsh in Hartwell. Beverly Strickland. She's been handling the separate documentation for the bait shop parcel, independent of Phil's work on the main estate. Call her on a Tuesday. She's always in on Tuesdays. She'll have everything ready. She's been expecting your call for over a year. I sat on that storage room floor until the light through the small window turned from morning to afternoon. Darnell knocked once to check on me, and I told him I was fine, which wasn't entirely true but wasn't entirely false either. Then my phone rang. Kevin. Mum, Jolene's been trying to reach you. She's worried. I'm at the shop, I said. I'm fine. Good. A pause. Have you given any thought what you'll do with it? Sell it, maybe, and put the money toward a smaller place. We could help you look for something. A senior community, maybe, something with activities where you wouldn't be so isolated. I'm 64, Kevin, not 92. I know, but the upkeep on a property like that. I'll manage. Another pause. Jolene thinks you should have the place appraised, just so you know what you're working with. Jolene thinks a lot of things, I said. Good night, Kevin. I was wrong to hang up without saying more. I understood that later. But in that moment, sitting in my late husband's storage room, holding a letter he'd written me, from beyond whatever is after this life, I didn't have the patience for it. That evening, Darnell brought over the rest of the casserole and we sat on the dock, watching the sun go down over the lake. I told him what I'd found. He wasn't surprised. Gary came out here about 10 months before he died, Darnell said. Spent a whole Saturday just sitting where you're sitting right now. Said he needed to make sure everything was set right. He shook his head slowly. He was a good man, quiet about the things that mattered to him, but good. Did he ever talk to you about the land value, the development? Some. He told me the companies had been calling, said he had no intention of letting them turn this into a parking lot for boat trailers and a tourist bar. Darnell looked out at the water, said he had a different use in mind, but that it wasn't his plan to make, it was yours. I called Beverly Strickland the following Tuesday. She was exactly what I needed, sharp, warm and prepared. She had a folder of documents 4 inches thick that Gary had been building for years. The appraisals, the county correspondence, letters from 2 of the 3 developers who had approached Gary, both offering significantly less than the land's assessed value. A 3rd letter from a company called Lakeshore Legacy Partners, who had proposed something different, a mixed-use conservation and community development with public shoreline access, a small inn, and a nature centre. Gary had been in talks with them before he got sick. The conversations had stalled, but not ended. He wanted you to be the one to decide how to proceed, Beverly told me. He was very clear about that. What would happen if I sold outright to one of the resort developers? You'd walk away with somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million, depending on the offer. The land would be cleared and developed within 18 months. The public shoreline access would be gone. The dock and the shop would be demolished. And Lakeshore Legacy. Less money up front. Probably $800,000 in direct purchase, plus revenue sharing over time from the inn and the nature centre. Long term, it could exceed the resort offer. But you'd also retain part ownership, which means ongoing involvement. She paused. Gary had a particular provision he wanted included if you went that route, a community room in the nature centre, designated for senior women's programs. He called it the Lakeview Room. I had to stop and look out her office window at the street below for a moment before I could speak. He knew, I said, to no one in particular. He knew you, Beverly said simply. I called Kevin that night and asked him to come to the shop. Just Kevin. I was specific about that. He hesitated, then said he'd come Friday evening after work. He arrived looking tired. He'd always carried stress in his jaw, a habit from childhood, and his jaw was tight when he stepped through the door. I'd made coffee. I put the folder on the table between us. He looked at it for a moment before touching it. This is about the bait shop, he said. Among other things. He opened the folder. I watched his face as he read the appraisals, watched it go from composed to confused to something I can only describe as a particular kind of stillness that happens when a person realizes they have badly miscalculated. 2 million, he said quietly. Closer to 2.5, depending on the offer. He set down the paper. Jolene is going to... He stopped himself. What was she going to do, Kevin? He looked at the table. She's already reached out to one of the developers, the Silver Point Group. She found their letter in the county's public records last week and called them. He rubbed his face. She told me she was just gathering information. I'd suspected something like this was coming. Still, hearing it said plainly by my own son made my stomach tighten. And you let her. I didn't know she'd actually called them. But you knew she was looking. He didn't answer, which was an answer. I reached into the folder and put Gary's letter on the table in front of him. Not all of it. The part that was about Kevin, the part that was honest and specific in the way Gary always was when he took his time about something. Kevin read it twice. When he looked up, his eyes were red. He knew, Kevin said. He loved you, I said. That's not the same as not knowing. We were quiet for a while. Outside, a pair of herons moved low over the water. The shop felt smaller with 2 people in it, in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. I'm sorry about the way things happened, Kevin said. The house. The way I let Jolene. He shook his head. You deserved better than that. You deserved better than me, standing there while she talked to you that way. I know. I've been trying to figure out when I stopped being the person you raised me to be. His voice cracked at the end of that sentence. He cleared his throat and looked away. I wanted to tell him he was still that person somewhere under the dress shirts and the careful silences and the marriage he'd built on someone else's confidence. But I'd learned, in 14 months of grief and in 2 days of discovery, that there's a limit to how much you can carry for someone who's still capable of carrying it themselves. That's your work to do, I said, not mine. He nodded. There's a baby coming, I said. I mean to be a grandmother to that child, but I'm not going to be a doormat for their mother to step over on her way to whatever she wants next. That's done. I know, he said. I'll talk to her. You'll need to do more than talk, Kevin. He stayed another hour. When he left, he hugged me at the door. A real one, the way he used to when he was 14 and thought he was too old for it, but did it anyway when something scared him. I held on an extra second. What came next happened faster than I expected and harder. 2 days after my dinner with Kevin, a woman showed up at the shop with a business card and the clipboard. She introduced herself as a representative from the Silver Point Group, the resort developer. She said she was there to do a preliminary assessment of the property. I didn't authorize any assessment, I said. She blinked. We received a request from a Mrs. Calloway at this address. I'm Mrs. Calloway, and I made no such request. She showed me the email. It had been sent for an address I didn't recognize, but the name on it was mine, bev.calloway@gmail.com. I've never had a Gmail account in my life. I have one email address. It's through my internet provider, and it's 11 years old, and I've never changed it. I asked the woman to leave and called Beverly Strickland. Someone created a fraudulent email account in your name, Beverly said after I'd read her the address. This is impersonation, potentially fraud depending on what they intended to do with it. Do you have any idea who? I have a strong idea, I said. The next morning, Beverly filed a formal complaint with the county clerk's office, notifying them that any correspondence regarding the Lakeview parcel from non-attorney sources should be considered potentially fraudulent. She also sent a cease and desist to the Silver Point Group. Kevin called me that afternoon. Jolene wanted to move things along, he said. His voice was flat in a new way, not the careful flatness from before, but something more like shock. She said she was helping, that the Silver Point offer would be better for everyone, and you were taking too long. She committed fraud, Kevin. A silence. I know. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I know, he said again, and this time it sounded like a man standing in the middle of a room that has just stopped looking familiar. The week that followed was the hardest one. I won't walk you through every hour of it. What I'll tell you is this. Kevin found emails on their shared computer, not just the one to Silver Point. Others to a property attorney in Grand Rapids, to a title company in Lansing, to someone at the county assessor's office. Jolene had been building a case for months, possibly longer, trying to establish that she and Kevin were the rightful decision makers for the property, using language about my advanced age and difficulty adjusting to life without Gary. She hadn't broken any major laws yet, but she'd come close enough to several that Beverly's strongly worded letters had real weight. Kevin told her to stop. She told him he was letting his mother manipulate him. He told her what his father had written in that letter. She told him Gary had never liked her and had poisoned my opinion of her from the start. I don't know exactly what was said after that. What I know is that Kevin called me on a Thursday morning and asked if he could come stay in the shop storage room for a few days, and I said yes. He slept on an air mattress next to Gary's old cabinet for a week. He helped me fix the loose boards on the dock. He came with me to my meeting with Beverly and with the representative from Lakeshore Legacy Partners, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Fitch who'd known Gary slightly and had the patience of someone who'd waited a long time for the right conversation. Kevin didn't push me toward any particular decision. He asked questions and took notes, and once, when Gerald was describing the community room Gary had specified, Kevin excused himself and went outside for a few minutes. When he came back, his eyes were dry, but his voice was quieter for the rest of the meeting. The Lakeshore Legacy Agreement took 3 weeks to finalize. I retained a partial ownership stake. The shoreline stays public. The dock stays. The bait shop building will be renovated into a visitor and nature center, with Gary's old hand-painted sign preserved and mounted inside. The Lakeview room will offer programs twice a week. Financial planning, legal literacy, wellness, specifically for women over 55 who have experienced major life transitions, divorce, widowhood, displacement. It was my addition to Gary's plan. He'd named the room. I decided what it would do. On the morning we signed the final paperwork, Beverly poured everyone a small cup of coffee from her office pot and made a toast that lasted about 12 seconds and said exactly what needed saying. I don't think she knew it was the best 12 seconds of that entire month. Jolene moved out of Maple Ridge Drive in December. I wasn't there for that and didn't need to be. Kevin told me she'd gone to stay with her mother in Ohio and that she was reassessing things, which is the kind of language people use when they're not ready to call something what it is. The baby was still coming. That was unchanged. I didn't know what to do with that for a while. The child was my grandchild. Whatever had happened between me and Jolene didn't change that, and I'm not the kind of person who lets a grudge reach down into the next generation. Gary hadn't been that kind of person either. Kevin and I talked about it honestly, which is new for us. We're practicing honesty in the way people practice anything difficult, slowly, with setbacks, trying again. There's a moment I keep coming back to, from about a month after the agreement was signed. I was out on the dock early in the morning, just me and the fog and the lake, the way Gary used to like it on weekends when the hardware store was closed and the phone wasn't ringing. I had my coffee. I had Eleanor's ring. Gary's mother's ring, the one he'd kept in the cabinet all those years, the one he left for me with a note that said, "Mom always wanted you to have this." It fit my right hand like it had been made for it. I was sitting there thinking about what the dock would look like in spring when the renovation started, when Darnell walked up the path with his own mug and didn't say anything for the first few minutes, just settled into the other chair and watched the water. "You doing okay?" he finally asked. "I think so," I said, still figuring out what that means. He nodded like that was sufficient. "Gary would have gotten a kick out of all this," he said after a while. "Not the hard parts, but the way it landed. He planned it." "He planned what he could plan," Darnell said. "The rest is you." I've thought about that a lot since then. What Gary planned and what I did with it. The line between those two things. The Lakeview Bait and Tackle had its last season as a bait shop the summer before Gary died, when he was already too sick to run it himself, but couldn't quite let go of the sign. I'd always thought of it as a leftover, something he'd inherited because there was nobody else, and held on to because he didn't know what else to do with it. I was wrong about that. The sign is still there. It'll stay there through the renovation. Gerald Fitch promised me that in writing, and I held him to it. I still drive out most mornings. I have a chair on the dock now, the good kind, the padded one Kevin brought from Maple Ridge Drive when he finally started packing things that were mine. I drink my coffee and I watch the lake come alive the way lakes do in the morning, slowly, layer by layer. Jolene thought she was giving me a consolation prize. A rotting shack that smells like fish, she said, couldn't be more fitting. She wasn't entirely wrong about the fitting part. It fits me perfectly, just not for the reasons she thought. If you've ever been handed something that looks like less than you deserved, I want to hear your story. Leave me a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, there are 2 more on this channel I think you'll want to watch next. I keep thinking about that locked cabinet under the window. Gary had the key hanging right there behind the counter the whole time. Small brass key on an old ring, in plain sight. Anyone could have found it. But it was waiting for me specifically because Gary knew I'd be the one who came looking without an agenda. That's the thing about people who treat you like you're worth nothing. They hand you the key themselves and never notice. Jolene looked at that bait shop and saw a liability. She saw mold and loose dockboards and 40 years of someone else's story that she hadn't been invited into. And because she saw her that way, she never once thought to look further. That's what happens when a person leads with greed instead of curiosity. The blinders come standard. She made her calculations fast, the way people do when they assume they're the smartest one in the room, and every fast calculation she made was wrong. I don't say that with satisfaction exactly, more with a kind of quiet recognition. What happened to Jolene wasn't punishment handed down from somewhere above. It was just the natural consequence of who she chose to be. She built her plans on the assumption that I was too old, too passive, too worn down by grief to pay attention. She was wrong on every count, and her being wrong had a cost she didn't see coming. Gary saw it coming. He saw it years before he died, and instead of confronting it directly, which wasn't really his way, he built something careful and quiet that would protect me after he was gone. That kind of foresight isn't luck. This is what happens when a person spends a lifetime paying attention, thinking ahead, making decisions based on something deeper than what's convenient right now. He taught me something about that without ever saying it plainly. The most important things he taught me by example. And what I had to bring to it, what I had to find in myself when I was sitting on the floor of that storage room with his letter in my hands, was the willingness to keep going when I would have been forgiven for falling apart. I was 64 years old, recently widowed, just told to clear out of my own home by the end of the month. Everything in me wanted to sit down somewhere and stay there. But there's a version of you that exists on the other side of the worst moments, and you don't get to meet her by staying still. Kevin is still finding his way. I'm watching that happen slowly, the way you watch something grow. Not by staring at it directly, but by noticing it between one visit and the next. He's teaching math to community college students now. He calls on Sunday mornings. He fixed a window frame at the shop last month without being asked. These are small things. They're also not small at all. What I know now that I didn't know a year ago is this. The people who try to hand you your ceiling, who decide what you're worth and where you belong, can only succeed if you believe them. Jolene called that bait shop useless. Gary saw it differently, and I had to decide whose vision I was going to build my life around. I chose Gary's. I chose mine. The lake looks the same as it always did from that dock, but I look at it differently now, and that changes everything.